Beneath the towering ramparts and arrow-slit eyes of medieval castles, there was another world hidden, humming, and alive with purpose. It was not a world of knights and glory, nor one of kings and conquest. It was a realm of fire, brine, smoke, and silence. A subterranean network where the battle wasn't against armies, but against time itself. Against rot, against hunger, against the slow, creeping ruin of decay. And the soldiers in this war weren't warriors in shining armor, but nameless cooks. Cellar hands, picklers, salt masters, smoke tenders, and apprentices barely old enough to lift a knife. In an age without electricity, refrigeration, or even basic ice, castles still managed to feed entire populations, hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 souls. Not just for days or weeks, but through long, merciless winters and brutal sieges. Imagine standing in the great kitchen of a 13th century stronghold, walls sweating with heat, the scent of charred oak and vinegar hanging thick in the air. This was more than a kitchen. It was an alchemical chamber, a fortress within a fortress. How they did it is not merely a story of culinary. Ingenuity is a map to an intelligence we've almost forgotten. A technology of patience, chemistry, geometry, and trust in natural laws that modern science is only now beginning to respect again. We start beneath the castle, not above, where banners waved and trumpets sang, but below, where light rarely reached and time moved differently. The castle cellars, or, as some chroniclers called them, stone wombs of survival. Medieval builders understood something we now attribute to environmental science. The deeper you dig into the earth, the more stable the temperature. Beneath layers of packed soil and thick limestone, they carved cavernous vaults that hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Go deeper, still into the lowest levels of these stone labyrinth sand, you'd find temperatures dropping into the high 40s. In the absence of ice, this was as close as nature could offer to refrigeration. But these were not crude holes in the ground, they were architectural masterpieces. Food wasn't just shoved into corners. It was sorted, categorized, mapped to temperature zones. In the depths, cheeses, milk, fresh meat. Mid-levels, wine, ale, root vegetables. Upper shelves, grains, apples, smoked goods. Castle staff, mostly boys too poor for schooling and girls too clever to marry, navigated these cold corridors daily. One account from Douala Fontaine tells of a young servant who vanished for 2 days, only to be discovered asleep beside a wine barrel. His excuse: "The wine warmed me after the tunnels confused me." He wasn't fired. But even in this calculated cold, nature fought back. Rats, mold, and floodwaters were relentless enemies. One castle lost an entire winter's worth of cheese to a rat invasion. Another nearly starved when heavy rains turned their root cellars into swamps. So preservation required more than shelter. It demanded control, precision, ritual, and above all, salt. Salt was not a seasoning. It was a currency, a defense system, a god. A large castle consumed upwards of 5,000 pounds of it each year, not just to flavor food but to save it, to sanctify it. Fine white salt for dairy and tender meat, coarse gray salt for fish, wild game, and heartier cuts. Salt didn't just dry food, it murdered bacteria by draining their water. It created barren landscapes where decay could not grow. A well-salted ham could endure months of storage. Salted cod, if packed correctly, could last through a siege. Salt was wealth. A good merchant could trade a pound of salt for a sheep. The most powerful salt traders owned fleets, controlled trade routes, and influenced kings. And where there is wealth, there is deceit. Records from the court of Henry II document merchants flogged for selling fake salt made of crushed chalk, a kind of chemical betrayal. But salt wasn't just about food. Castle doctors, rudimentary as their practices were prescribed, salted lemon peels for fevers, salted fish for headaches, and salt rubs for infections. A superstition, maybe, or perhaps an early recognition of salt's antimicrobial power. Still, not all foods took kindly to brine. Some needed smoke. The smokehouses of medieval castles were worlds unto themselves, positioned just outside the inner walls, far enough to prevent fire, close enough for watchful eyes. These structures ran like furnaces during late autumn. Records from Carfleet Castle speak of smoking chambers curing over 200 pounds of meat a day at peak season. That's more than a survival tactic. That's infrastructure. Wood choice mattered. Oak for strength and longevity. Applewood for nobility, used in feasts and festivals. Alderwood for fish. The smoke carried flavor, but also preservative compounds, formaldehydes, that sealed the meat in a microbial prison. The process was slow. A ham could hang for 3 months. The fires burned continuously. The smoke master, yes, that was a real title, was a craftsman of time and air. It was not a job for amateurs. If you miscalculated the airflow, the meat would mold. If you rushed the timing, it would rot from within. The best smoke masters could smell a spoiled haunch before it turned. They worked in shifts, tending coals by torchlight, faces streaked with soot, eyes red from smoke. They were revered and feared. Some were even buried with their tools. Yet even smoked meat had limits. For plants, vegetables, and herbs, The answer was older than the castle itself. Vinegar. The pickling vats found in castle ruins are staggering in scale. Some held over 100 gallons, enough to preserve 800 pounds of produce, and they used them ferociously. Nearly half the vegetable yield from some castles was pickled within days of harvest. Nothing was off limits. Cabbage, carrots, turnips, beets, even eggs. When preserved in beet brine, the eggs turned violet, a novelty that delighted noble children and puzzled travelers. Imported lemons, oranges, and olives preserved in vinegar or salt were guarded like treasure. One irate baron threatened to behead his cook for sharing his private store of pickled plums with the garrison. But this wasn't chaos. It was chemistry. Castle vinegar operations were precise, often overseen by a dedicated pickle master. They brewed their own vinegars, cider, wine, even malt. They monitored pH levels by taste, used grape leaves to keep vegetables crisp, and layered garlic, dill, and mustard seed in exact proportions. The smell must have been overwhelming, a riot of Thames, spice, and fermentation wafting through castle walls. And then there was honey. In many ways, honey was the crown jewel of medieval food preservation. Entire castle departments were built around it. Hives were kept roughly a quarter-mile from the main fortress, near wild meadows rich in clover and heather. A typical bee operation involved over 100 hives. The beekeepers, often semi-independent, lived outside the walls. In stone cottages, they were paid well, fed better, and respected by both soldier and steward. Why honey? Because honey does not rot. Its combination of low water content, acidity, and natural hydrogen peroxide make it almost immortal. Archaeologists have discovered 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs still edible. Castles knew this. They used honey to preserve fruits, root vegetables, even meats. Some recipes called for submerging entire birds, geese, pigeons, partridges, in sealed crocks of honey. Others involved layering vegetables between honey-soaked linens. Infirmaries kept their own honey reserves. Light, spring honey for coughs. Dark autumn honey for wound salves. They even made medicated honey pastes, medieval lozenges for soldiers. With throat infections, a mixture of honey, garlic, and ground yarrow. Crude, but shockingly effective. And still, this was not enough. A castle was a machine, a living organism, and its organs, the kitchens, storerooms, smokehouses, bee yards, pickling halls, had to be synchronized. They were guided by architecture. Castles were not built randomly. Their design was mathematical. Ventilation shafts ran from cellars to towers. When wind hit the upper vents, it created suction, pulling cold air through the structure. Pressure differential ventilation, we'd call it now. Natural air conditioning, they called it then. Storage rooms were arranged by altitude and airflow. Grains in dry, high towers. Cheese in damp, low chambers. Some walls were angled to prevent mice from scaling them. Others contained secret catwalks for actual cats, furry exterminators patrolling between the stones. Even the mortars sometimes held secrets. Crushed mint and lavender, sealed into the cracks, helped ward off insects. The kitchens themselves were divided. The pantry for dry goods, the buttery for ale, the spicery for the lord's treasured imports. Some had separate cheese-aging rooms, with tilted stone shelves to drain whey. Others maintained drip vaults under the meat room spits that collected brine and runoff to avoid contamination. Nothing was accidental, and none of it worked without people. The master cook commanded an army up to 50 workers in large castles, with a dozen focused solely on preservation. Apprentices trained for years before ever lighting a fire. They learned to identify spoilage by smell, texture, sound. They memorized storage rules like scripture. One surviving diary from a teenage apprentice laments being forced to recite all 200 storage regulations before being allowed to touch the salted boar. But it worked. It kept them alive. Then came the test no cookbook could prepare them for. Winter relentless, bone deep, and long. Not just a season, but a siege in slow motion. When snow fell thick across the parapets and game vanished from the woods. When fires flickered low, and the cold crept even into the stone hearts of castles, this was when the true brilliance of medieval preservation revealed itself. The question was no longer how to prepare food, it was how to outlast hunger without descending into desperation. Castle life pivoted around food like a great wheel, and that wheel turned according to the seasons. In spring, preservation was triaged, the last softening roots, smoking what meat remained before it spoiled. Summer was a parade of perishable abundance, berries, greens, orchard fruits, dried brine, or candied as quickly as hands could move. Autumn was the final sprint. The most intense, the kitchen transformed into an industrial furnace of preparation. Smoking chambers worked around the clock. Vinegar vats bubbled. Herbs hung from rafters. Salted meat was layered between crates of apples, sealed with wax and prayer. Records from Lincoln Castle show that over 2,000 pounds of produce were preserved in a single August week, but it was winter that haunted the margins of every plan, and the calendar within castle walls divided it not by months, but by scarcity. Early winter meant fresh stores, the newly smoked hams, the barrels just tapped, the pickled pears still firm and bright. Midwinter was 4 deeps, goods, dried legumes, sour roots, hardened bread. Late winter was survival. By then, even the vinegar tasted tired. And still, they had to feed not just nobles, but garrisons, children, servants, masons, blacksmiths, clergy, falconers, musicians, even prisoners. A castle was more than a residence. It was a city-state behind stone, and food, quite literally, governed peace. Give the soldiers spoiled rations, and you risk mutiny. Feed the nobles bland fare, and you invite wrath. Let the servants starve, and the machinery of the castle grinds to dust. Which is why inventory wasn't guesswork, it was ritual. Castle kitchens maintained intricate tracking systems long before spreadsheets and barcodes. Grains were measured by standardized scoops, some carved with markings passed down for generations. Wines bore chalk tally marks on barrel heads. Preserved meats carried tags of their bone, leather, or parchment etched with dates, cuts, and curing methods. Incredibly, archaeologists have found some of these tags buried in collapsed cellars. Their ink still visible under centuries of dust. But records alone weren't enough. It took memory, discipline, a kind of culinary vigilance. The master cook had to calculate consumption rates with near-military precision. Feed too generously in December, and March becomes famine. Ration too strictly, and morale collapses. Some castles even appointed a portioner, a steward whose sole duty was to ensure food was dispensed fairly, not just based on rank, but on season. And then there were the apprentices. Teenagers, mostly some orphans, others indebted children, paying their families' way. Their initiation wasn't chopping onions or stirring soup. It was learning spoilage, how cheese sounds when it sours, how smoked meat smells when improperly cured, how grain shifts when it's infested. They weren't just learning to cook, they were learning to listen to food, to smell it, weigh it, tap it, judge it not with instruments, but with intuition. One diary fragment, found beneath the scorched ruins of Rochester Castle, includes a preservation chant. If it bends, it breaks. If it squeaks, it sleeps. If it weeps, it feeds no one. It sounds like superstition, but it's not. Because when food failed, systems collapsed. Take the siege of Dover Castle in 1216. The walls were strong, the archers skilled, but it was the kitchen that saved them. For 3 months, they resisted the invading French forces, not by outfighting them, but by outlasting them. Their secret weapon, a flawlessly managed preservation system. Smote, meats were rotated daily. Pickled vegetables stored in clay jars packed in sand to absorb moisture. And when the main cellar flooded after a heavy rainstorm, the kitchen staff moved over to tons of provisions to upper spread overnight. Without that, the defenders would have starved before spring. Still, things went wrong. Always, rats chewed through grain saxo. Cooks began storing grain in sealed ceramic pots. Mold destroyed a year's worth of cheese, so vinegar rubs and wheel rotation were instituted. Bad meat slipped through and poisoned 3 guards after that. A new rule: no meat was served unless the preservation master signed off personally. Some solutions were even stranger. When apples began spoiling too early one winter, a castle in Brittany buried them in sand layered with dried rosemary. When turnips turned mushy, they soaked them in strong brine and wrapped them in cloth soaked in honey. Some ideas failed. Others became tradition. Not everything was so grim. Food brought joy, too. In midwinter, castles held preservation feasts, where the best of their stores were presented in strange and celebratory ways. Honey-preserved pears, salted lemon tarts, pickled quail eggs, dyed red with beetroot, dried figs, stuffed with almonds and smoked eel, an entire boar's head, cured for 3 weeks and glazed with honey. It was a way of reminding everyone noble or that survival could still taste like celebration. But behind the feasts were festivals of labor. The real celebration happened earlier in the chaos of preservation season. Late autumn in a castle kitchen sounded like a forge and smelled like a storm. Smoke, vinegar, salt, fermenting grain, fires roaring, knives clanging, jars boiling, children running, dogs barking. They worked for weeks, sometimes sleeping on straw mats in corners, eating with blackened fingers and aprons soaked through. And always there was ale. Records suggest preservation season consumed more ale than any other time of year. Whether as hydration or as morale booster, no one is sure. One cook's notes include this complaint: drunk, the pickle master again. Second, bat ruined. Lord insists on vinegar tasting less like piss, more like apples. Humor, it seems, was a preservation tool too. As winter dragged on, the castle's strategy shifted again. They divided their remaining stores into 3 categories: still, fresh, recently cured goods, rationable long-term, stable foods, questionable foods that might be failing soon. The third category was the trickiest. It required judgment, flexibility, risk. Some was fed to animals. Some was fermented into vinegar or turned into stew. Some, like questionable wine, was boiled into syrup or used to flavor barley porridge. Nothing was wasted if it could be transformed. And here lies the deeper truth. Food preservation wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. It reflected a worldview, a deep, almost spiritual reverence for transformation, decay, and rebirth. Just as the castle walls stood to repel enemies, the preservation chambers stood to resist entropy, a refusal to be consumed by time. It's easy to forget now, in a world of vacuum seals and digital expiry dates, but the people who managed these systems weren't just cooks or servants, they were knowledge keepers, practitioners of applied survival. Their expertise passed down orally, marked in tally sticks, scratched into walls was as vital as any sword or spear, and though we no longer fear winter the same way, their legacy remains, in the smoky flavor of cured ham, in the tang of vinegar on pickled vegetables, in the sweetness of honey-dried fruit. Flavors born of necessity, preserved by time, and passed on generation by generation until they became memory. But not every castle survived, and not every system held. Some fell, not from outside attack, but from within. Mismanagement, greed, a failure to understand that preservation wasn't just about food, it was about foresight. A castle could fall, not with a battering ram, but with a spoiled grain silo. That's how fragile the balance truly was. And yet, in surviving castles, beneath the stones, we still find echoes. Jars sealed with beeswax, bone tags with etched dates, crates lined with dried herbs, a bottle of vinegar, intact after 600 years, still sharp enough to sting the tongue. We've inherited the ruins, but also the wisdom, and the deeper you go into these ruins, the more you realize these weren't just kitchens. They were laboratories, cathedrals of preservation. This was their second wall of defense, against hunger, against spoilage, against forgetting, and this was only part of the story. When you're ready, I'll show you what happened when preservation met politics, alchemy, and power. Because some secrets, buried beneath the mortar and smoke, were never meant to be shared. Then let's descend even deeper beneath the salt, smoke, and honey, beneath the cellars and recipes, to where preservation stopped being just a necessity and became something stranger. Because in certain castles, food wasn't just stored, it was encrypted, ritualized, hidden in codes and symbols, wrapped not in cloth, but in secrecy. And what began as simple practicality began to brush against the occult, the political, even the philosophical. Some lords weren't just preserving food, they were preserving control. Let's begin with something odd. In the ruins of Château de Montségur, a Cathar stronghold in the Pyrenees, archaeologists uncovered a sealed stone chamber no larger than a pantry. Inside were dozens of clay vessels, their contents long evaporated, but their arrangement was peculiar, grouped not by size or purpose, but by number, a sequence, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, the Fibonacci spiral, nature's code. At first, it seemed a coincidence. Then, researchers discovered similar patterns in other castles once associated with heretical Sexta Templars. The Cathars, certain Benedictine offshoots. Why would food storage follow mathematical spirals? Why mark salt jars with star maps? Why engrave pickling vats with constellations? Some believe these were signatures, markers of hidden knowledge, encrypted in the mundane. In a world where texts could be burned and languages banned, food became a secret script. A jar sealed with beeswax and ash might not just contain preserved pears, it might mark a date, a name, a prophecy. Preservation as resistance. Others went further. Take the mysterious Liber Solis, the Book of Salt, attributed to a shadowy cook philosopher known only as Nicodemus of Rheims. The manuscript reads like a preservation manual, but one layered with esoteric allegory. It speaks of salting the flesh to purify the soul, of vinegar, preserving truth through rot, of honey sealing that which cannot be spoken. Scholars still debate whether it was simply metaphor or a coded text hiding Cathar theology beneath kitchen terms. But for the lords of medieval Europe, control over food meant control over time itself. To command the seasons, to make summer fruits appear in February, to offer meat at Lent without raising suspicion was a kind of magic, a demonstration of divine favor. When nobles served honey-glazed quail in midwinter or unveiled oranges, soaked in vinegar from distant Moorish groves, they weren't just feeding their guests. They were performing dominion over nature, over scarcity, over the fear of death itself. Preserved food became a political tool, a soft weapon. Banquets were carefully choreographed. Dishes timed, not for flavor, but for effect. Salted fish imported from the Baltics, smoked venison served with wine reduction sauces thickened by dried cherries, candied ginger root from Genoa, honeyed rose petals from Provence. These weren't just luxuries, they were statements of reach, of wealth, of mystery. And those who managed the systems behind these performances, the preservation masters. The spicers, the cellarers, were gatekeepers of that power. They had more than recipes, they had access, influence, secrets. In one document from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a dispute is recorded between two stewards over the soul of the larder, not its contents, its soul. The argument centered on a sealed clay jarret's lid marked with strange symbols. No one remembered what it contained. No one dared open it. It had been passed down between stewards for generations. It was tradition and taboo in some castles, especially those linked to the alchemical revival of the 14th century. Food preservation blurred entirely into philosophy. Alchemists viewed rot not as failure but as transformation. Fermentation as spiritual transmutation. Pickling as the preservation of prima materia honey, with its incorruptible nature, was called the golden sheath. Vinegar, the sapientia, the acid of wisdom. A recipe found hidden in the wall of a collapsed tower at Bergeltz describes a method for preserving goose in a compound of honey, saffron, and ground pearls. Absurd, perhaps, or perhaps symbolic. Pearls represented purity in alchemical texts. Saffron, the sun. Honey, immortality. The dish was never meant to be eaten. It was a ritual of preservation. And not all preservation was physical. In the monastery of Cluny, a parchment was discovered listing not foods, but dreams, the recorded visions of monks. Each entry marked by the phase of the moon, the temperature, the meal eaten before bed, pickled onions, salted fish, honeyed bread. Were they mapping dreams to food, or was food simply a medium for dream work? It raises a larger question. What, exactly, were they preserving? Not just calories, not just meat and apples and cheese, but memory, power, identity. The most enigmatic example comes from the records of Castle Bragnes, the same fortress later tied to the Dracula legend. Deep in its storage vaults was a black room, a sealed space accessible only to the Lord and his preservation master. Inside were said to be 7 jars, each containing an unrotting piece of fruit, an apple, a plum, a fig, each over a century old, represerved every generation with a different method. Honey, vinegar, salt, smoke, and more exotic preparations. Now lost. They weren't food anymore. They were talismans, anchors, proof that something could endure. And in a way, isn't that what preservation is? A resistance to forgetting, to time, to erasure. These methods, some simple, some surreal, survived because they worked, but they were also layered with meaning. A smoked ham wasn't just meat, was a monument to the labor of dozens, the design of builders, the math of salt, the timing of fire. A pickled pear was a map of trade routes, of spice roads, of harvests and storms, and human longing. We inherited these things without thinking. We smear mustard on meat, not knowing that castle cooks once mixed their own, grinding seeds grown in fortified gardens beside the moat. We eat sauerkraut from glass jars, not knowing that in medieval strongholds, barrels of cabbage fermented beside weapons stockpiles because both were essential to survive a siege. We sip mead as novelty, not knowing that in the heart of the beeyards, beekeepers once sang to their hives to keep them calm. Songs passed down orally, never written, believed to preserve not just honey but harmony. And perhaps they did, because when you step back from the individual methods, the salting, smoking, fermenting, pickling, you begin to see something larger, a system of knowledge, a worldview, not built on control, but on balance, on respect for the rhythms of life and death, on a reverence for the unseen. There was no technology in medieval preservation, no metal boxes, no sterilized labs, but there was a deeper technology, a human technology, built from observation, repetition, oral history, craft. And today, as we battle food waste on a global scale, as we forget how to feed ourselves without machines, maybe their knowledge isn't obsolete, maybe it's essential. Maybe the question is not, how did they preserve food, but what are we forgetting to preserve? Not just in our pantries, but in ourselves. Because when the fires go out, and the harvests fail, and the wind howls across the battlements of whatever modern fortress we call home, what will remain? What have we salted? What have we smoked? What have we buried in honey, in vinegar, in memory? What will endure? You now know what the castles knew, and what they feared, because food was never just sustenance. It was survival. It was power. It was prophecy, and it was sacred. Let that knowledge preserve you.